On Practicing Contradiction by Mao Zedong. This is actually my first book by Mao, and I must say that it is pretty good. Now, before we start the review, let's go over who the author is first. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, in a village called Shaoshuan, sorry if I mispronounced that, in the Hunan province during the Qing dynasty. He was born to a peasant family which had owned 3 acres of land. However, his family was well off compared to most peasants in his area, as his father was a very successful grain dealer. He had received very to little no education, and by age 13 he was working on the fields full time. When he was 17, he had left home to attend a secondary school. He later joined the Kuomintang in 1911, which overthrew the monarchy of China and established a republic. He graduated from school in 1918 and later became a teacher. In 1921, he was aware and glad for the Russian Revolution and their success, which made him join the Chinese Communist Party. Moving forward, during the Second World War, Mao and the Communists teamed up with the Kuomintang to fight off the Japanese Imperial Army. After they defeated the Japanese in China, they ended up having a civil war. And of course, we know the outcome was the Communists win. And the Nationals ended up fleeing to Taiwan. Mao then became leader of China from 1949 to 1959 and later became paramount leader from then on until his death in 1976. Under his rule, China experienced a dramatic increase in literacy, population growth, women gaining equal rights, ethnic people gaining autonomy within their own provinces, and dramatic increase of life expectancy. However, the Great Leap Forward is a subject for debate, as many believe that it did help in certain areas but not a lot of others. The famine being another issue, but however, Western historians tend to ignore that China commonly had famines even before it was a socialist country. Mao even tried to help, but when his policies failed, he made a public apology and accepted the error. But it should also be noted that under Mao's rule that was the last famine to ever happen in China. Now, the book I am reading is presented by Slovenian leftist Slavoj Žižek. I'm going to be honest and tell you that I did not read what he had to say because, to be honest, I do not care. He's a good man, and I am currently reading one of his books that I will review in the future, but I am not interested in his critiques, as I'm only interested in what Mao has to say. Now, I must mention that each passage in this book are from different time periods, from the 1930s to the 1960s, if I remember correctly. So, let's begin with the review. The first chapter was written on January 5th, 1930, and is called "A Single Spark Can Start a Prairie Fire." Now, this is stated that this was a letter written by Mao in criticism of their pessimistic views within the Chinese Communist Party. He states that the party does not know how to appraise the current situation they are in, since they are under attack by the Kuomintang. The important saying that I have marked here is on page 33, and it says, quote, "Here we can apply the old Chinese saying, a single spark can start a prairie fire. In other words, our forces, although small at present, will grow rapidly in the conditions prevailing in China. Their growth is not only possible, but indeed inevitable." End quote. Now, I chose this line for a very good reason. Even when times look tough and against your favor, a spark of action or motivation will overcome it. Think about it. How many times did people like the Bolsheviks felt that the odds were against them, yet they had a goal and they saw it and kept fighting and they ended up winning? Another good example would be the Cuban Revolution. Originally started off with 600 members, ended with the majority of the people supporting the Communist Party of Cuba. Also, 12% that opposed them ended up leaving. This is a passage that I believe we as communists should take. Now, moving on to chapter 2, which is called "Opposed Book Worship," and in this chapter is broken up into passages. In the first passage, it is called "No Investigation, No Right to Speak," and it begins with, quote, "Unless you have investigated a problem, you will be deprived of the right to speak on it." Isn't that too harsh? Not in the least. When you have not probed into a problem, into the present facts and its history, and know nothing of the essentials, whatever you say about it will undoubtedly be nonsense. Talking nonsense solves no problems. As everyone knows, so why is it unjust to deprive you of the right to speak? Quite a few comrades always keep their eyes shut and talk nonsense, and for a communist, that is disgraceful. How can a communist keep his eyes shut and talk nonsense? And at the end of the first part, it says, quote, "It won't do, it won't do. You must investigate. You must not talk nonsense," end quote. Here is mainly critique on ignorance within the party, and personally I think this can be applied pretty much anywhere. Someone who thinks they have the answer to something without proper investigation or proper insight will spread ignorance amongst the people. This contradicts our goals as communists, as we only seek the truth and proper answers. We already see this with the centrists, liberals, and conservatives spouting that what they believe is to be the truth when they are spewing propaganda. We want to avoid that and stick with the truth from proper research, which will be hard since most of Western media is just propaganda. Continues in passage 3 with the issue of book worshipping in part 3 called Opposed to Book Worship. He says that people will believe whatever is in a book as the undeniable truth. Quote, "When we say that a directive of a higher organ of leadership, but because its contents conform with both the objective and subjective circumstances of the struggle and meet its requirements, it is quite wrong to take a formalistic attitude and blindly carry out directives without discussing and examining them in the light of actual conditions simply because they come from a higher organ," end quote. As we can clearly see here, is that no matter where the information comes from, it must always be examined in order to avoid dogmatism. Communism is a science, not a dogmatic thought pattern, so we must examine everything we are told, even if it comes from a well-written book. Passage 4 of Chapter 2, I have another passage highlighted which states, quote, "Do you doubt this conclusion? Facts will force you to accept it. Just try to appraise the political situation or guide the struggle without making any investigation, and you will see whether or not such appraisal or guidance is groundless and idealist, and whether or not it will lead to opportunist or punchist errors. Certainly it will. This is not because of a failure to study the specific social situation carefully before making the plans, as often happens in our Red Army guerrilla units," end quote. In other words, no matter how much one will try to appraise it, make up another outcome, or even gloss over the truth, the cold hard facts will always be there, even if the facts do not line up with certain people's views. Another part that I have highlighted comes at the end of passage 4, which is basically him saying we should wipe out idealism within communism. Mao is right, as idealism has gotten nobody nowhere. An example of idealism on the left would be that of left comms. They are too idealistic with their picture-perfect form of communism, that they do not focus how they should get there. Same goes with the anarchists, albeit they will take action unlike the left comms, but they do not have a form of concrete planning. He says that the only way to get rid of such ideal thoughts are through investigation. In passage 5, he goes over the social classes that require investigation, and they are: number 1, the industrial proletariat; number 2, the handcraft workers; number 3, the farm laborers; number 4, the poor peasants; number 5, the urban poor; number 6, the lumpen proletariat; number 7, the master hand craftsmen; number 8, the small merchants; number 9, the middle peasants; number 10, the rich peasants; number 11, the landlords; number 12, the commercial bourgeois; and number 13, the industrial bourgeoisie. Now, needless to say that the material conditions have changed internationally for both third and first world countries. So again, needless to say, there needs to be a new social class of investigation, especially within the first world country, if we want to at least educate people on communism, that is. On Chapter 2, near the end of Chapter 2, I have 3 passages highlighted in Part 8. The first part is about hold fact-finding meetings and undertake them through investigation, as this can lead to correct conclusions and proper theories. The second part that I have highlighted are the type of people that should attend the fact-finding meetings. Note, these people do not include the pseudo-intellectuals such as Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, or Sargon of Akkad, but mainly people that do extensive research. Now, Mao states that these people should be both socially and economically aware of the current conditions, constantly up to date on the news and other important issues. These types of people will have pragmatic ideas to lead to a proper revolution. Last part I have marked states that you should make your own notes. This is, of course, keeps up with the results of the meetings and sort good ideas from the bad ideas and so on. It's basically, simplified. Now, chapter 3 is titled On Practice, and I have a couple of things highlighted, but for the sake of time, I will shorten some. On page 53 of chapter 3, he states that man's knowledge depends mainly on his activity in material production, which he will then become more familiar with the phenomena with the laws of nature and himself. He goes on to say that through learning this, man will understand the laws of relation with man, meaning it will build a better communal view of society. He also states that people in different classes will also enter in a different way to define relations of production and will then engage in production to meet their own material needs. This helps the member of each of society better interact and understand the need of their own class. Next, he states on how Marxism helps man from a lower level of understanding to a much higher level of understanding. Quote, Marxists hold that in human society, activity and production develop step by step from a lower to a higher level, and that consequently man's knowledge, whether of nature or of society, also develops step by step from a lower to a higher level. That is, from the shallower to the deeper. Men were necessarily confined to a one-sided understanding of history, and for one thing, the bias of exploiting classes always distorted history, and for another, the small scale of production limited man's outlook. This is in a very important passage as he explains that man has been confined to one side of the story in order to keep control of the masses. This still goes on today with our liberal democracy, which is a form of democracy that gives us the illusion of a choice as the upper class chooses who really wins. No matter how much that TV newscaster or that zombie army man says, our freedom only exists for the upper class, and mainly just a certain half of that class as well. Anyway, on page 54, Mao states that man is held high on the criterion of the truth of knowledge of the external world by Marxists. He also states that if a man wants to succeed in his work, he has to bring his idea to that into a correspondence with the laws of the objective world. Of course, if they do not correspond with the real world, it will fail. If it does correspond to the real world, then it will succeed. However, when he fails, he must learn from his failure and try again to succeed. One of my favorite quotes that I have highlighted goes over theory. Quote, the truth of any knowledge or theory is determined not by subjective feelings, but by objective results in social practice. End quote. This is a quote that I think we as communists should always remember. This can keep us vigilant and make sure we avoid the mistakes of those in past have made. Now on page 60 of chapter 3, he brings up the rationalism within philosophy. Quote, in the history of philosophy, there is the rationalist school that admits the reality of reason and not of experience, believing that reason alone is reliable while perceptual experience is not. This school errs by turning things upside down. The rational is reliable precisely because it has its sources in sense perception. Otherwise, it would be like water without a source, a tree without roots, subjective, self-endangered, and unreliable. Rationalism with just reason alone is nothing more than a farce, to be honest, regardless of what the so-called skeptics on YouTube say. Without the perception, it is nothing more than dribble. Anyway, this concludes chapters 1 through 3. Now let's move on to the next 3 chapters. Chapter 4 is on contradiction. Like in chapter 2, this chapter is broken into passages. but I'll only go over the parts that I have highlighted. In part 1, which is titled The Two World Outlooks, Mao critiques the capitalist views of the world. Quote, "They search in an oversimplified way outside a thing for the causes of development, and they deny the theory of materialist dialectics, which holds that development arises from the contradictions inside a thing. Consequently, they can explain neither the qualitative diversity of things nor the phenomenon of one quality changing into another." End quote. It should also be noted that he is critiquing the metaphysical outlook of the world. Just because some things happen to be simplistic does not mean it is wrong. This can be said with the idea of materialism in the Marxist sense, meaning that the material conditions surrounding us will affect the way humanity will act, think, and evolve. This indeed is a simplistic outlook, but an outlook that has been proven to be true. He later reiterates this on page 71. Quote, "This dialectical world outlook teaches us primarily how to observe and analyze the movement of opposites in different things, and on the basis of such analysis to indicate the methods for resolving contradictions. It is therefore most important for us to understand the law of contradiction in things in a concrete way." End quote. This is dialectical materialism, something that I feel the far right does not understand. This is a scientific outlook of the world, and it is important not only to communists, but also for the people as a whole, so that we can be actively engaged with the ever-changing movements in life. In passage 2 of chapter 4, universality of contradiction, one part that I have highlighted is on page 73, which says, quote, "Every difference in men's concepts should be regarded as reflecting an objective contradiction. Objective contradictions are reflected in subjective thinking, and this process constitutes the contradictory movement of concepts, pushes forward the development of thought, and ceaselessly solves problems in man's thinking." In other words, the subjective thought that man has is nothing more than a contradiction to that of the objective truth. Again, we see this all around the world with the whitewashing of history. As the saying goes, victors write the history. In passage 3 of chapter 4, there is something marked that I believe that we as communists should know and remember. Quote, "Contradiction within the Communist Party is resolved by the method of criticism and self-criticism." End quote. This is something we should all take into account. This is how ML countries outside of Europe manage to stay in power. It is through critiquing party members and self-critiquing. Through criticism, we not only learn from our own mistakes, but mistakes by other leaders. Mao critiqued Stalin's leadership and pointed out his mistakes. Through that, they managed to avoid the problems they had, they being USSR. Same goes to Enver Hoxha when he critiqued Mao and Tito. Albania managed to avoid the problems that those countries would later face. Even Kim Jong-il critiqued the major mistakes of the Eastern Bloc and how they tried to emulate the Soviet Union. This is how communism grows and becomes more applicable. Now we move on to chapter 5, which is titled Combat Liberalism. This by all means is my favorite chapter in the book. Before I go on reading this, it should be noted that by liberalism, it means that of say like social liberalism, economic liberalism. In other words, people like liberals, classical liberals, neoliberals, conservatives, and libertarians. Basically what American politics are. This is a short chapter, so I'll quickly summarize it for you. He says that the Chinese Communist Party stand for the ideological struggle and not let things pass for the name of peace, i.e. letting people say whatever they want and not correcting them. We should call them out for it and tell them why it is wrong and critique them for it. This is not the same as, say, like liberal free speech, what we are used to seeing in most countries. It's quite different. Unlike free speech, this form of speech in practice encourages the shutting down of ignorant speech and other forms of provocative speech that encourages unrest. This is something that will get the centrists mad and cry out anger, but they fail to understand that free speech is a farce. Through combating liberalism, we encourage responsible speech over that of say whatever you want. As we have seen in America, free speech has started to spread unrest, as the best idea is often debated, even though the best idea is right there, they don't choose it. However, for the best idea to be taken means we need to shut down the disruptive speech. Again, the liberals, centrists, and conservatives do not understand this in favor of feelings rather than facts. Sorry for that tangent, but it had to be said. Liberalism is an opposing aspect to communism, so we should do away with it, as again it creates unrest. Chapter 6 is titled "The Chinese People Cannot Be Cowed by the Atom Bomb." This was written on January 28, 1955. I make note of the date because 9 years and 7 months before this meeting, the Americans dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By this time, the Soviet Union had also constructed their atom bomb in order to protect themselves from the Americans. Of course, the outcome of this was the Cold War, which during this time when this was written, it was during the Cold War. Now this chapter is about a page and a half, so again, I'll just summarize it. Mao is basically saying that America cannot annihilate the Chinese nation with their bombs due to China having a population of 600 million. He says that history has shown that in the war, victory has chosen the communist. He isn't completely wrong, but he's not right either, as we saw in places such as Malaysia, as the West backed the Malaysian nationalists in defeat of the communists. The Cold War does not count in technicality since no real war ever broke out, only proxy wars. And even then that's debatable since the War of Vietnam ended up in Vietnamese victory and the Korean War wasn't a draw. However, the war between imperialism and anti-imperialism still wages today. Even though the imperial powers seem to be winning, it will not be long until they will fall over. With people in certain countries tired of their governing system, people will begin to try to prep up for revolution. Imperialism and capitalism are nothing more than dialectics, with the contradictions growing each year to the point it will crumble. That's how it has always been and how it always will be. Science can never be denied. Now moving on to chapters 7 to 9. Chapter 7 is titled U.S. Imperialism is a Paper Tiger. This speech was given to Latin American public figures on July 14, 1956. Mao starts off by saying that America is aggressively flaunting the banner of anti-communism, but however the country of America owes debt around the world, from Africa to Latin America to Europe to Oceania and so on. In response, the people within those countries hate America for it, which is no surprise. Just because a country's leader likes you does not mean the people do. Pinochet may have liked America, but the Chileans hated us. Same goes for Honduras. The government may have loved us, but the people, oh boy, they really do hate us, especially now. This is the result of imperialism, but just like every monstrous creature, we are nothing more than mortal. Meaning that all imperial powers are weak on the inside, and like I stated in the previous chapter, the dialectics within imperialism will always lead to it crumbling. Great empires don't last for long, just look at the Roman Empire. In chapter 8, Mao goes over the economic system under Stalin in the USSR. Now this chapter is short and I have not made any marks, so I'll just go over the quote I have highlighted. I haven't made too many marks, but I'll go over the quote that I have highlighted. Quote, in urban people's communes, capitalists can enter and serve as personnel, but the capitalist label should stay on them. With respect to socialism and communism, what is meant by constructive socialism, we raise 2 points. Point number 1, the concentrated manifestation of constructive socialism is making socialist, all-embracing public ownership a reality. And point number 2, constructive socialism means turning commune-level collective ownerships into public ownership. Some comrades disapprove of drawing such a hard and fast line between these two types of ownership systems, seeing that communes are as being already completely public ownership, as in the Anshan Iron and Steel Works. The other is commune-level collective ownership. If we do not recognize this, what is the use of socialist construction? Stalin admitted the distinction when he spoke of 3 conditions. These three basic conditions make sense and may be summarized as follows. 1. Increase social output. 2. Raise collective ownership to public ownership. And 3. Go from exchange of commodities to exchange of products, from exchange value to use value. End quote. Now, moving on to Chapter 9, Mao gives his critiques on Stalin's economics problems in the USSR. He says the basic error was his mistrust in the peasants. This is not Mao's first time critiquing Stalin having little to no faith in the peasantry, as he mentioned that on his theory of the mass line. On page 118, he says that Stalin did not consider that human knowledge along with capability to transform didn't have limit, thus limiting their actions. Now that was the only thing I had marked. I apologize for this part being short, but I will revisit this later. I may even do a video on the economic system of the USSR. Aside from me not being too knowledgeable of their whole history of the whole Soviet economic system, I feel that I need to do more research on that. Now it's time to move on to the last three chapters. Chapter 10 is on how to handle the contradictions among the people. And unlike chapters 2 and 4, it is broken up into passages. He states that China's government is a democratic dictatorship that is led by the working people. He says that they are a dictatorship because they need to flush out the reactionaries within the country. Not to mention the fact that socialism is a transitional state between capitalism to communism. So, socialism within itself still has dialectics within it. Hence why sociological theory is needed in order to help us get to communism. This is where people have a huge misunderstanding of communism due to lack of reading and years of propaganda. He continues to say that the dictatorship is also to suppress the freedoms of the landlords, counter-revolutionaries, and capitalists. Of course, that is needed within any government that wishes to remain stable. Of course, the people running the dictatorship are the working people, and not just a single person. Mao goes on to say that people have civil liberties, if they are not counter-revolutionaries that is, and should have their freedoms protected by the working class. He even points out that their freedom is determined by leadership, and their democracy is based on central power rather than anarchy, as he states that anarchy does not accord with the wishes of the people. As is common sense due to the fact anarchy is idealist and focuses on mob rule. In part 8 of chapter 10, Mao stresses the importance of schools of thoughts, arts, and science, saying that all of these will encourage new thoughts and opening towards debate. This is something that I think everyone should hold on to. This is the importance of education. Now moving on to chapter 11, Mao goes over where correct ideas come from. He says that great ideas come from social practice. He says that it is through man's determined thinking is where good ideas come from. Now whether they are good ideas for some, that's another thing. Now moving on to the last chapter. Chapter 12, which is titled Talk on Questions of Philosophy, he basically goes over the ways philosophy can act and the bourgeois and proletariat philosophy. Sadly, I had nothing marked here and I apologize for that. And that was a review of On Practice and Contradiction by Mao Zedong. Now, it's no question I think this book is a good read, as it goes over the challenges they faced during the pre-revolutionary times, to international issues, and to ways on how to have a functioning communist party. This book is a must-read if you are a communist. If you're not a communist, I recommend you read it anyway. You might find this interesting. Now, for my next 5 videos here is what I have planned. I'll go over green conservatism and why I find that to be important. I'll do a video about chivalry. After that, I'll do a video on language. Then I'll do a video on socialist realism, which is an art style. And then I'll cap it off with a book review on Beyond Good and Evil by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. So be on the lookout for those videos. If you have any questions or critiques, leave them down in the comment section below. Your comments are not, your comments are heated. I do appreciate them. And this is Bakura98 signing off.